The email arrived while my coffee machine was still humming, filling the kitchen with a sound that felt normal, almost comforting. The subject line was clinical. Attached, documents. No greeting. No explanation. I opened it slowly. Divorce papers. Signed. Dated. Final. Then came the photo. My husband stood on the balcony of our vacation house, sunlight on his face, his arm wrapped around a young woman in a short white dress. She was smiling like she'd already won something. Below the image, one line of text waited for me to read it twice. The house is mine now. I didn't scream. I didn't drop my cup. I simply sat down. Minutes later, my phone began vibrating, family notifications lighting up the screen. Someone had shared the photo. A few people reacted instantly. No one asked me a single question. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just a divorce. It was a performance. And I had been cast as the woman who was supposed to break quietly in the background. I didn't. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. What do people expect a woman to do when she's publicly replaced? Cry? Beg? Explain herself to everyone who suddenly feels entitled to an opinion? I'm Laura Kensington. And that morning, instead of reacting the way everyone expected, I finished my coffee and closed my laptop. Not because I was numb, but because I understood something very clearly. Whatever was happening wasn't meant to be fair. It was meant to be humiliating. So I decided not to give him the reaction he was waiting for. I had been married for 12 years, long enough to learn that stability isn't something you're given, it's something you maintain. In our home, I was the one who maintained it. I remembered birthdays before reminders were sent. I noticed when the heater sounded different, when the fridge needed servicing, when his mother's tone on the phone meant she was upset even though she said she wasn't. I filled gaps quietly so life would keep running smoothly. People assumed my husband led our life because he spoke louder. The truth was simpler. I handled the structure while he handled the image. The vacation house was a perfect example. Everyone called it his achievement. But I was the one who researched the location, reviewed inspection reports, followed up on the delayed paperwork. I kept digital copies of everything, labeled and backed up, because that's how my mind worked, order before comfort. At home, I adjusted more than I asked. If he was distant, I softened. If he dismissed something I brought up, I let it go. I told myself maturity looked like restraint. Over time, that restraint became invisible labor. And invisible labor is easy to overlook until the person doing it stops. So when he decided to end our marriage through an email, it didn't feel sudden. It felt like the last step in a long pattern of being underestimated. What surprised him wasn't my silence. It was how prepared that silence had made me. The warning signs had been there for years, tiny but persistent, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. I had been. He started making decisions without consulting me, small at first, booking trips, scheduling renovations, shifting finances. I noticed, of course, and let it slide. It seemed easier than arguing. Friends would shrug when I mentioned it, and family assumed I was overreacting. He's just busy, they said. It's not a big deal. Then came the casual remarks in front of others. A joke about how I don't really handle the big stuff, or a comment on a friend's post implying I was overbearing or controlling. People laughed. I didn't. I smiled politely, internalizing everything, cataloging each slight for future reference. At home, the pattern repeated. A dismissive tone when I suggested a minor repair. A brief eye roll when I reminded him of a deadline. Each time, I felt the familiar flicker of irritation in my chest, quickly replaced by calm observation. By the time he sent the email with the divorce papers and the photo, I already understood the type of man he was, the kind who believes you can be erased with a signature, a message, a staged image. And yet, I also knew the kind of woman I had become. I didn't panic. I didn't beg. I waited. Because I had already started playing the long game. The day after the email, he showed up at our shared office, our so-called shared life, smiling as if nothing had happened. He leaned casually against the counter, boasting about finalizing the vacation house, clearly expecting me to look shocked, hurt, even desperate. I sipped my tea slowly, watching him, noting every gesture. The arrogance was almost charming if it weren't so infuriating. He laughed loudly at a joke I hadn't heard, assuming I was embarrassed. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I simply nodded politely and returned to my work. At the company luncheon that afternoon, whispers followed me. People asked about the photo circulating online. Comments were thinly veiled assumptions. I must be devastated, right? I smiled, muttered something vague about a misunderstanding, and carried on. He didn't understand the most dangerous thing about me. He could broadcast humiliation, but he could not dictate my response. The public dismissal, the ridicule, the assumption that I'd crumble, all of it was ineffective because I refused to feed it. By the end of the day, the whispers faded, replaced by curiosity. Some colleagues tried to fill me in, others avoided the topic entirely. But I had observed enough. The pattern, the overconfidence, the gaps in his narrative. Every misstep he made, every casual brag, was evidence. He believed control came from spectacle. I knew control came from patience. And in that patience, I had already begun writing my next move. As the days passed, the isolation grew. Family members subtly took his side without even knowing it. Friends hesitated, unsure who to comfort. Even my closest confidant seemed to offer advice in hushed tones, careful not to upset the inevitable. Their caution, though well-intentioned, made me feel like I was standing alone on shifting ground. He didn't stop. Small, calculated slights piled up, ignoring my texts, pretending not to hear me in conversations, rearranging plans without telling me. Each time, he laughed when I questioned him, calling me overly sensitive. Gaslighting became his weapon. "You're imagining things," he'd say. "You always overreact." I could have spiraled. I could have yelled, begged, or walked away in despair. But I didn't. Instead, I observed. I catalogued. Every lie, every overreach, every casual betrayal went into a quiet mental ledger. Even in the darkest moments of self-doubt, I reminded myself, I am not defined by his perception of me. I still held my dignity, my composure, and my awareness. And as he strutted through the social circles we shared, believing he had won, I knew something he didn't. He had only created the illusion of control. The more he flaunted his triumph, the clearer the path became for me. Silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And endurance, I realized, was the first step toward justice. It happened on a Friday. I received notice that one of the joint accounts had been frozen, ostensibly for review. Along with it came another email from him, this one even colder, a recap of the vacation house deed, details of transfers, and a smug line reminding me that the financial future he'd promised me was already under someone else's control. For a moment, the world felt heavy. I walked through our apartment, noting the familiarity of each object, the things I had organized, the memories embedded in corners, and realized how little of it I could claim publicly. Friends whispered, some avoided me, family seemed hesitant. Everyone assumed the story was over. He had created a narrative in which I had lost everything: property, reputation, influence. Even I had to admit it looked convincing from the outside. He smiled when we crossed paths that evening, assuming I was beaten. But I wasn't. I sat quietly in the dim light of the kitchen, thinking not about what was gone, but about what I had observed, documented, and retained over the years, every signature, every decision, every misstep. The apparent loss wasn't a conclusion. It was the setup, the false peak. While he believed his victory was complete, I was simply waiting, gathering, and planning. The illusion of defeat is far more powerful than defeat itself. He thought he had taken control. He had only handed me the blueprint. After the apparent loss, I withdrew, not out of fear, but to observe. I spent evenings reviewing documents, receipts, emails, and photos I had meticulously saved over the years. Everything mattered. Every detail could become leverage. He continued his displays of triumph, posting on social media, casually mentioning the house in conversations, flaunting the young woman at gatherings. The world saw a celebration. I saw patterns. I saw arrogance. I saw the gaps he assumed no one would notice. I didn't react publicly. I didn't confront. I didn't warn. My silence was deliberate, my patience precise. People began to misjudge me, assuming my absence or quiet meant weakness. That misconception became my greatest advantage. Even in isolation, I found strength in observation. I noticed how his friends subtly enabled his arrogance. I noted the legal loopholes he had overlooked. I mapped every relationship, every influence, every expectation. I realized that endurance wasn't just surviving, it was gathering insight while others thought I was defeated. And as the days turned into weeks, I felt a quiet shift within me, a calm certainty that when the time came, the truth would not just be revealed, it would be unavoidable. I was ready. It didn't happen all at once. It was subtle, the small repetitions, the careless details that no one else noticed. He had a rhythm, predictable in arrogance, sloppy in overconfidence. Each boast, each omission, each casual insult became a thread I could follow. I realized that the divorce papers, the vacation house, the frozen accounts, none of it was random. It was a performance designed to unsettle me, to make me question myself. And yet, by observing without reacting, I started connecting the dots. I saw his reliance on public perception, his overconfidence in assumed control, and his neglect of documentation that could protect him or expose him. I revisited our shared contracts, our emails, our bank statements. I cross-checked dates, permissions, signatures. Everything he had assumed he had erased or controlled had been quietly preserved. I noticed how he always left gaps when bragging, confident that no one would notice the omissions. At social gatherings, I listened more carefully. He repeated stories, overemphasized successes, and misrepresented facts. To anyone else, these were minor slips. To me, they were pieces of the puzzle. Each pattern exposed his truth, and with each realization, my confidence grew. By the end of that week, I felt the first real shift. The humiliation, the isolation, the apparent losses, they were no longer the story. The story was mine to write. And for the first time since that morning with the email, I smiled, not because I felt relief, but because I understood power differently now. Power didn't come from visibility. It came from knowledge. And I had more than he ever imagined. While he flaunted his victory to friends, family, and social media, I quietly assembled evidence. Everything I had ever kept, documents, emails, photographs, bank statements, was meticulously organized. I had records of every transaction, every agreement, every signature. Not because I anticipated betrayal, but because I valued order. Now, that order became my advantage. I compiled timelines of his actions, cataloged inconsistencies in his stories, and noted every misrepresentation. Each gap was a lever I could pull. Friends and colleagues had long assumed I was passive, compliant. They didn't realize my silence was strategic. Every insult, every oversight, every attempt to undermine me had been quietly noted. I also sought witnesses, people who had observed his arrogance or neglect, people who had unknowingly provided validation. None suspected I was preparing. They saw only the smiling, composed woman who didn't react, the woman who endured quietly while others assumed defeat. Legally, socially, publicly, I had the foundations to act, and he had left them wide open. He had believed control came from spectacle, from public humiliation. But he had underestimated the power of documentation and restraint. By the time anyone realized the pattern, the truth would be undeniable. And I knew something else, too. My actions would be measured. No rush. No impulsive moves. The most dangerous power comes from calm confidence, from knowing exactly when to act and when to wait. I closed my files, sipped my evening tea, and felt the shift settle in me. He had overplayed his hand. And the quiet, patient woman he had underestimated was now in control. The audience watching me might not see the work behind the scenes, but they would see the outcome. And the outcome would be irreversible. By now, something within me had changed. The Laura who had quietly endured insults, slights, and public dismissal no longer existed. She had transformed into someone who no longer sought validation from anyone, not friends, not family, not the man who believed he had the power to define her. I realized calmness was not indifference. Calmness was clarity. Every action, every pause, every word, or lack of one, was intentional. The fear and anger that had once threatened to overwhelm me had been replaced with measured confidence. I no longer reacted, I orchestrated. In my mind, I replayed every encounter, every careless boasting, every overreach he had made. Each mistake was now a stepping stone, a blueprint of leverage I could use when the moment came. I no longer felt trapped by circumstances, I was liberated by awareness. I also understood patience differently. It wasn't waiting out of fear or hesitation. It was waiting as a strategy. Each day I maintained my composure, each day I observed quietly, added to my reservoir of power. People saw a composed, unshaken woman. What they couldn't see was the meticulous planning happening behind the scenes, the slow building of leverage that would soon turn the tables entirely. And with that internal transformation, the first seeds of true control had been sown. I was no longer a character in someone else's story. I was the author, the one who would decide how the next chapters unfolded. Silence had become my ally, endurance my shield, and awareness my weapon. With clarity came strategy. I didn't rush. I didn't confront. Every move I planned was measured, deliberate, designed to unfold at the right time. I understood that haste could ruin everything. Power isn't about force, it's about precision. I began by reviewing every legal document related to the house, the accounts, and our shared assets. I confirmed signatures, verified timelines, and cross-checked every clause that he assumed he controlled. Each small oversight he had made became a tool. Every assumption he'd taken for granted was now a potential lever. Next, I reached out discreetly to people who had been indirectly affected by his overconfidence, colleagues who had witnessed his arrogance, friends who had overheard his casual boasts, even administrative staff who had handled our property paperwork. Each conversation was subtle, leaving only breadcrumbs that, when combined, would create a full picture of his overreach. Meanwhile, I maintained my routine. Coffee in the morning, work, subtle social appearances. I let him continue believing he was untouchable. Each smile I offered, each polite nod, reinforced the illusion that nothing had changed. That illusion was essential, it lulled him into a false sense of security. I also rehearsed the timing of my actions. The revelation had to be undeniable, complete, and inescapable. The documents, the witnesses, the inconsistencies, they all needed to converge at the same moment for maximum effect. In private, I visualized the eventual scene, his shock, the collective realization by those who mattered, the irreversible shift in perception. I didn't feel vengeance in a loud, explosive sense. I felt something quieter, deeper, a satisfaction that came from knowing the truth would speak louder than any attempt he had made to silence or humiliate me. Finally, I rested. I slept with the calm certainty that my plan was sound. The game had begun, and for the first time, I was completely in control. He had acted impulsively. I would act intentionally. The first opportunity came sooner than I expected. A social gathering at our shared vacation house, this time, under the guise of celebrating a business success he had posted about online. He strutted around, showing off the house as if the walls themselves were his victory. I arrived quietly, unassuming, carrying nothing but the calm composure I had honed over weeks. People noticed me, but no one expected a reaction. He glanced my way, smiling confidently, expecting discomfort or at least polite awkwardness. I offered neither. I simply observed. Inside, I noted the small details, which friends he relied on for applause, which colleagues followed his lead without thinking, which family members hesitated in the presence of conflict. Everything became part of the mental map I had been building. The arena of power was the same, but now the stakes were higher, and I knew how to play it. I engaged minimally, spoke casually to select individuals, and let subtle glances and questions hint at knowledge he thought I lacked. Each interaction reinforced the illusion of normalcy while slowly shifting attention. Those who had assumed I was passive began noticing cracks in his narrative. By the end of the evening, the air had changed. Confidence still radiated from him, but uncertainty began to ripple through the room. The performance he had perfected for months was starting to falter. And though no one yet understood it, the quiet, patient woman standing in the corner was already orchestrating the unraveling. Control wasn't loud. Control wasn't visible. But it was absolute. He didn't realize how close the walls were closing in. His confidence had shifted into arrogance, and arrogance always reveals too much. That night, he talked louder, laughed harder, made claims that didn't hold up under scrutiny. The young woman he paraded beside him mirrored his bravado, unaware of the fragility in his performance. I let him. I observed quietly as he recounted stories of the house, the finances, the supposed victories over me. Each claim was slightly exaggerated, slightly inconsistent. Each boast left a trail for those paying attention, tiny contradictions, overlooked details, and casual admissions of his mismanagement. In the corner of the room, I subtly prompted questions to colleagues and friends. Innocent inquiries about timelines, approvals, or signatures. He responded defensively, flustered at the attention on minor technicalities. The more he tried to cover, the more visible the gaps became. He believed the spectacle of dominance would silence suspicion. But he forgot one thing: I had documentation, witnesses, and a timeline that left no room for denial. And I had patience. By the time the evening ended, he had spoken enough to incriminate himself. The audience he had relied on for admiration now watched with subtle doubt. Friends whispered to each other. Family members exchanged glances. The arrogance that had made him untouchable now exposed his errors for anyone willing to look. He had overreached. And in doing so, he had provided the exact leverage I had been waiting for. I remained composed, smiling lightly, a cup of wine in hand. Outside, he saw only normalcy. Inside, I knew the game was about to shift irreversibly. The moment arrived quietly, without fanfare. I handed a folder to our mutual lawyer, evidence I had meticulously compiled, timestamps, signed documents, emails, photographs, and witness statements. Everything he assumed he controlled or had hidden was now organized, undeniable, and ready for scrutiny. The lawyer, familiar with our history, glanced at me with a mix of surprise and respect. I said nothing, only nodded. The evidence spoke louder than any words I could have used. Later that afternoon, I convened the meeting at the vacation house, inviting family, friends, and a few colleagues who had been witnesses to his overconfidence. He entered, exuding the same smug confidence, expecting applause, or at least deference. I let the room settle before I spoke. Calm, measured, deliberate. I summarized the events, letting the documentation do the talking. Timestamps, inconsistencies, overlooked approvals, all laid bare. Each contradiction, each omission, became clear. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point fingers. I simply let the truth unfold. The effect was immediate. Whispers turned to gasps. Some guests leaned in, incredulous. Friends who had doubted me began connecting the dots themselves. Family members who had assumed my weakness now exchanged stunned glances. The image of control he had cultivated so carefully began to crumble before him. He tried to interject, to defend himself, to explain. But every word was met with a document, a photograph, a timeline. Silence replaced his arrogance. The room understood what I had known all along: he had underestimated me. By the time the meeting ended, the truth was undeniable. He had not just lost the perception battle, he had lost control entirely. The house, the accounts, the social leverage he believed he possessed were all exposed in the light of careful preparation and patient observation. And I didn't need to raise my voice or act dramatically. Justice had been served quietly, irrevocably, and elegantly. The aftermath of the truth release was immediate, visible, and inescapable. The arrogance he had relied on evaporated under the scrutiny of evidence. Friends who had once whispered approvingly at his boasts now looked at him with subtle disbelief. Family members who had been hesitant to take my side began questioning the narrative he had spun for months. At gatherings, the social power he had wielded so confidently diminished. Casual conversations that had once elevated him now exposed gaps in his story. Colleagues shared observations he had tried to hide, and the young woman at his side began to notice the cracks in his facade. He realized, too late, that control had never come from the spectacle he created. It came from preparation, knowledge, and the quiet authority I had cultivated. Every public display of confidence had left him vulnerable to scrutiny, and now the truth was undeniable. I watched calmly, interacting politely, smiling lightly as the room absorbed what had happened. There was no triumphalism in my actions, no cruelty in my satisfaction. The collapse was organic, inevitable, and utterly irreversible. By the time the day ended, the social and public perception had shifted completely. He was no longer the one commanding attention or admiration. That space now belonged quietly, firmly, and unquestioningly to me. Control had returned to the rightful hands. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of his overreach unfolded quietly but completely. Legal adjustments confirmed my rights over the vacation house and joint accounts. Friends and family who had doubted or hesitated began to approach me with cautious respect. Social circles shifted subtly but unmistakably. I had reclaimed the influence he had tried to claim. He retreated, both socially and publicly, no longer able to assert the dominance he had flaunted. Attempts to regain control were met with polite refusal, professional boundaries, and the undeniable weight of evidence he had overlooked. Each misstep he had made now served as a permanent reminder of the overconfidence that had undone him. Meanwhile, I moved through my days with calm composure, no longer defined by past humiliation or the fear of social judgment. My confidence, once quiet, had been recognized and respected. I no longer needed to assert myself loudly, the world acknowledged it for me. Evenings were spent quietly, savoring ordinary pleasures, the small routines I had maintained through the chaos. There was no need for dramatics, no desire for revenge beyond justice. The balance had shifted naturally, irrevocably, and elegantly. I realized something essential. Power, patience, and preparation are often quieter than people expect, yet far more effective. The morning coffee, the blocked emails, the patient observation, they had all been tools in reclaiming what was mine. And as I watched the sunset over the city from my own balcony, I felt a quiet, deep satisfaction. The storm had passed. The truth had spoken. And I had emerged, calm, composed, and unshakable. Looking back, I understood the lesson wasn't about vengeance, it was about dignity. The humiliation, the betrayal, the false victories, they had all tested me, but none had defined me. What defined me was how I chose to respond. I learned that strength doesn't need to be loud. Power doesn't require anger. Justice doesn't demand cruelty. By remaining composed, observing carefully, and acting strategically, I had reclaimed not just my home and finances, but my self-respect and authority. People often underestimate the quiet ones, the patient, the enduring. But patience paired with awareness is far more formidable than impulsive action. I had been underestimated for years, and that misjudgment became my advantage. Now, when I move through life, I do so without fear of judgment or expectation. The past no longer dictates my present. I have proven, to everyone who doubted me, including myself at times, that calm clarity, meticulous preparation, and unwavering dignity are the most powerful tools anyone can wield. The storm had passed. The world had witnessed the truth. And I, Laura Kensington, had emerged not just victorious, but unshakably composed, quietly claiming my rightful place in the life I had always built.